This panel focuses, as you can see, on, we've titled it Melting Ice and Rising Tension, Arctic Shipping and its Implications for the U.S. To keep pace with the rest of the program, I'm not going to read through extensively the biographies. I'll just say that this panel is quite literally threading together from across the country. We have folks who have come from the think tank and strategy perspective, the operator's perspective with VAdm, so truly we talk about strategic partners, truly a international partnership, and we're even joined virtually by Snyder, who quite literally, his ship just came in, and he is calling in from Dutch Harbor today. So we'll talk, I think it's 6 in the morning, roughly, 6 or 7 in the morning?
Pretty darn close.
Yeah.
Dirty.
So Duke's a good friend and a real supporter of both Sydney Maritime as well as of this program, and so we appreciate him getting up very early for the program. I'm going to go right into the discussion point. We're going to start with Vice Admiral Gautier. I will read through briefly with Admiral Gautier. Admiral Gautier assumed the duties of the Coast Guard Deputy Commandant for Operations in June 2022. In this capacity, he is responsible for the development of operational strategy, policy, guidance, and resources that address national priorities. Previously, he served as the Deputy Commander, Coast Guard Pacific Area, where he was responsible for all Coast Guard missions spanning from the Rocky Mountains west to the waters off of the eastern coast of Africa. Vice Admiral Gautier. He's going to... And just to cue this up, I've asked, in our discussions beforehand, I've asked the Admiral to discuss a little bit of the current state of play and overview of the Coast Guard's icebreaker fleet, the role of the U.S. within the Arctic Council, and some of the programs and strategies to supplement the U.S. Arctic and polar navigation capacity. So, Admiral.
Thanks very much, James, and what a pleasure to be here, especially with such distinguished colleagues here in the room and then remotely. I got to tell you, as a guy who's been into Dutch Harbor many, many times, it's an absolutely beautiful location with lots and lots to do, right? Right. And I just want to quickly do a shout out for the U.S. Navy League. The Navy League is such a great friend of the United States Coast Guard, and we were reminded of that just last week when we came very, very close to having circumstances that would have prevented us from being here, if you know what I'm talking about. And actually, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about has been backed by and connected by the Navy League to Capitol Hill and support the Coast Guard, so I'm really grateful for that. So as James said, I'll just take a few minutes to give you some context on how the Coast Guard views the Arctic, what we do there, what our role is. So when we think about the Coast Guard, especially as we stretch out across the globe, we like to think of the Coast Guard as the preeminent agency to reinforce maritime governance around the world, and never so much so as in the U.S. Arctic. And we do that in a couple of different ways. The first thing is that the Arctic, we are in Arctic state. Most of Alaska is considered to be in the Arctic by definition. And so therefore the Coast Guard has to provide all of the same services to the state of Alaska in the Arctic as we do with CONUS and Hawaii and other territories around the world, right? So search and rescue, environmental protection, maritime safety, security, stewardship. And so we do that in a number of different ways, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you would like. The second thing is that we're a border agency there. Let us remember that we share a maritime border with Russia, with all the complexities of that relationship, especially given the current circumstances of the war in Ukraine. So an example of this is just a few weeks ago, Coast Guard cutter Stratton in the US EEZ provided US presence and governance in the face of a pop-up Russian summer exercise. So a number of frigates and submarines were operating in the US EEZ, which actually is perfectly legal. But we were present to exert our own sovereignty and actually protect the fishing fleet from harassment there. So, as an example of border security. And then up in the high Arctic, outside and north of the US Arctic, we view ourselves as in partnership with allies and others to reinforce the kind of global norms that we all want to keep in the Arctic despite the increased tensions that we continue to face. So these are things that are done through the Arctic Council, through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And in terms of Coast Guard lead, doing things like representing us in the International Maritime Organization to, a few years ago, establish a traffic separation scheme in the Bering, through the Bering, to make sure that the transits in that neck-down waterway are safe and secure. It's doing things like port access route studies in and around Alaska so we can establish fairways if necessary to make sure that the increases in traffic that I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about means that we have the safe and secure waterways so we can alleviate some of the pollution risk that comes with that. So that's just kind of a quick walkthrough of sort of Coast Guard activities in 3 bins and how we see ourselves.
Okay, thank you. A question, Admiral. As we look forward to enhancing or potentially expanding the Coast Guard Arctic class vessels, could you talk a little bit or share a little bit about what the current programs are for that?
So I deliberately didn't answer your first question that you teed
Okay.
up for me, and so that's, you can ask me specifically about that. Yeah, so I know there's great interest in Coast Guard icebreaker construction. So on a quick update with that, we have come a very, very long way with the support of Congress to let a contract for the construction of the first 2 polar security cutters to a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Having said that, coming a long way there, the project is slower than we had anticipated and slower than what we would like to see. And that's for a number of reasons, COVID being one, but we're not going to hang our hat on that specifically. So the contract for the first polar security cutter was written so that delivery would be in 2025. We know that we're not going to meet that delivery date. And we don't have a great estimate on when we will, because it's really important to get this next step right, and that's getting the detailed design for the first PSC. So we think, though, having said that, around 2029 for the delivery of the first one. We are making, under the new ownership of Bollinger, the shipyard is re-energized, and they're doing things in conjunction with the Coast Guard to do things like build the first panels, build the first hull sections in an experimental way so they can test some of the theories on how this very complex ship has to be constructed. So they finished the first and they're working on the second, and so far that looks pretty positive. So we're looking at ways of condensing down that timeline. In the meantime, we have asked in the fiscal year 2024 budget, drama aside, for a commercially available icebreaker and for support from Congress to purchase one of those so we can field the capability sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you. Of course, the U.S., as the Admiral had mentioned, is one of a number of partners, both from a legal perspective as well as from an operational perspective. So I'd like to pivot to Duke in Dutch Harbor, as we said. Duke was, as I understand it, very active in writing the current Polar Code. In fact, he's quite literally authored a practical operator's guide published by the Nautical Institute on polar navigation. Could you talk a little bit about the evolution of the Polar Code, where we currently sit with that, and how that's impacting the current operations and fleet, global fleet?
Absolutely, and thanks very much for the invitation to participate, albeit from just short of the Arctic Circle at this point in time, having come back from a voyage of very little ice, which I think is important to the conversations when we talk about the Arctic and climate change. The Polar Code now, of course, comes at a time when there is far more interest in the Arctic than we had ever seen in the past. My old colleagues, VAdm as an example, one of the largest companies operating regularly in Arctic waters, has been doing so for decades. We've seen the changes and welcome the first mandatory code from the IMO in the way of the Polar Code. It had a genesis decades ago with guidelines. As we all know, the shipping industry guidelines are only that. There's no requirement to follow them. And it really comes down to the wiser players, the smarter players, paying heed to guidelines. But with the Polar Code now, with mandatory requirements, we've seen a rather interesting surge in what I'll call attempts to meet mandatory guidelines, particularly on the crewing side of things and the training side. And it impacts us in many ways, with some requirements for IMO sanctioned required training and certification. There's been a plethora of training institutions around the world that have suddenly come on stream to meet the demand from mariners to have pieces of paper in their pockets. Some of the training institutes are at the top of the game, and some of them are in it for other reasons and not quite there. And we're seeing what's coming out as rubber stamping in many ways of certifications through Polar Code operations, which the flag states, the coastal states, port state controllers are having trouble to wade through. We had this year an interesting shift in that suddenly the coastal states were beginning to pay more attention to certification requirements, and we were struggling to get some of our people onto ships that suddenly required or noticed that they needed people with certification. This all comes as the Polar Code goes from a virgin mandatory code in 2016 to maturity, or enforcement of the provisions are now there. We need to continuously mold that forward, move that forward, to allow industry to respond, to allow industry to meet the requirements, but also to evolve the requirements as the conditions change. One final piece that I think has to be taken into consideration, particularly in the forum here, with recent events in the Ukraine and the implication of sanctions, that has impacted the mariner's life at sea. In some ways more than it impacts some of the entities that are the intended targets of the sanctions. And it is making it harder for us to get people onto ships that have the skills and the experience to operate in Arctic waters. It's a huge, huge envelope of things covered under Polar Code, covered under international geopolitics, but it all comes down to how do we get the right people on the ships that need them with the right skills.
Well, just to continue that, Duke, could you share then, I'm interested as a product of the Maritime Academy system in the US and now a faculty member there myself, what is it that our education system can be doing or perhaps should be doing that we're not currently doing to provide the right skill set for the next generation of mariners, acknowledging the many constraints that you mentioned. You know, the attraction and retention issue is a industry-wide challenge, not particular just to polar or Arctic, but what from an education standpoint should we be doing?
That's a fairly broad question, James, and one of the things I want to start with in trying to answer that is saying that institutions like SUNY they're at the top of the curve. Your team is putting out quality material. Your graduates are well trained. They're well educated. You're one of the places that we can turn to and say, you come from there. Good on you. It's not so much what the training institutions need to be doing. It's the oversight of the training institutions by the government agencies that have that authority. When we see a training institute somewhere in the world who gets flag state approval to conduct Four Waters operations courses at basic and advanced level. And the product that comes out is actually below the standard that is required of the IMO and the STCW requirements for training and knowledge. It's that oversight of this massive training institutions out there that have suddenly jumped on the bandwagon, putting people out with certificates that purport to meet Polar Code, IMO requirements, and or the local regulations, but are substandard. So it's beyond the schools, it's on the oversight in my mind.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, I did not pay him for that plug to SUNY. I want to turn to Courtney for a moment, because you truly bring the day-to-day operator's perspective, just continuing the discussion around mariner training, workforce attraction and retention. Obviously, I think we would all agree the operations within the Arctic, perhaps the challenges that face the industry are amplified for operators in the Arctic, given their unique circumstances and the operational constraints. So could you talk a little bit about VAdm's role with partnerships, how they see the attraction and retention dialogue evolving within the industry, what the efforts are happening?
Yeah, no problem. So just to give you a quick overview of VAdm, just so you understand what we do. So we do own and operate 60 ships and actually operate about 100 internationally, but my job specifically is to look after our 3 icebreakers, 2 of which are Canadian flagged, so your version of the Jones Act. And then we also look after the port management of the VAdm line in the Arctic. So now in regards to your question about retention of crew, so yes, there is a shortage of Canadian seafarers as well on the market. Every Canadian ship owning company has brought this to our attention. Coast Guard actually came to our office Canadian Coast Guard came to our office just a couple months ago asking, how are you guys dealing with this? And not bragging, but to be honest, we don't have this issue on our 2 icebreakers, and I think this is because we put a lot of time and effort into our crews. And I put a list together. I don't usually like to have notes, but I think it's important to share what we do so that maybe anybody else can implement the same type of things to make sure to hold on to the crew and attract and retain their seafarers. So on our icebreakers, it's really important that they have obviously their advanced training for Polar Code purposes, and that they have Arctic experience. And because we also carry oil on our ships, we need type for endorsement. So this is a lot of certificates, and not a lot of seafarers have all of these. So we have to be sure that we retain our crew. So one of our issues is actually not retaining, but offering the option to move up the ladder on the ship. Because no one is leaving, we're having the issue more of people having to leave because they want to move up and, say, gain experience as a chief officer, but the chief officer in the role has been in it for 30 years. So that's something we are battling. So one of the ways we're working around that is that, so if, for example, if one of our 3rd mates has the 2nd mate's tickets, we will pay him his 2nd mate wage, just so that he's at least, we're honoring their certificate there. Another thing we did is we created an extra role. So if the 2nd mate wants to start, has been in this role, or she's been in this role for many years, we say, okay, well, we've made the chief officer junior role. So this gives them the opportunity to start training as a chief officer before the position becomes available. Another thing, so we do hire ship management companies, so we don't actually hire our crew ourselves, but we do I personally spend about a week on board the ships every trip that they do. So every month and a half I'm on board the ships, getting all the crew feedback, listening to what they have to say, getting their input, and so that they can also vent to someone who isn't a seafarer, or someone that they haven't just spent the last 6 weeks with. So yeah, I take all that crew feedback and bring it back to the office as well. Another thing we do, well, one of the big complaints, and as it was mentioned earlier this morning, is that young people nowadays, they want to have Wi-Fi access, and they're born and brought up on this, so we can't say no to that. So we've added Starlink to our icebreakers just to make sure that they have internet access at all times. What else? Whenever we're building a new ship, for example, one of our icebreakers needed to be replaced. So we went to the crew and surveyed them and asked for different type of feedback. What would they like on their ships? What's something that they want on the new ship that they're going to be working on? And it could be something like that actually like on the bridge they wanted floor to ceiling windows, okay? Like easier, like safer, safe construction ideas is great, but then another suggestion was a bigger gym. So again, we're able to implement that and have a bigger gym for the crew. So it's just like little things so that they know that they're heard. Another thing is we do an annual crew seminar. So one of the things I find lacking, and I'm not sure that I'm new to this school here, I've never been, but I don't know if you guys have leadership training for like captain or chief officer roles, so and chief engineer roles. So one of the important things is that we have crew seminars and we discuss these types of things. This past year we did the DISC assessment and learned all of our personalities and how we can work better together and what type of leadership we all require. What else do we do here? And another thing we do is we offer the Dialogue app to all of our seafarers. So basically, it's just an application on their phone, so they have immediate access to physical, for if they have anything physically wrong, or mental health care, so they have a therapist on standby on their phone, so that they have ready access to all physical and mental health. And then we also provide this to their families, so their husbands or wives and children, and that they also have a peace of mind for their family at home as well. So these are just a few of the things that we've done. And again, I'm not sharing this as like this is what we do, you should imitate it, but more like just ideas of different things that people can implement in order to increase crew retention on board their ships.
Thank you. And as a housekeeping note, Courtney is listed here as the Assistant Manager of Arctic Projects, but she's actually the head of Arctic Operations at VAdm. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So that's just so everyone's aware. Could you talk a little bit about, given the unique circumstances from an operator in polar and Arctic operations, the role of stakeholders in a ongoing basis?
Yeah, so I don't know if any of you guys are familiar, say, with the VAdm mine, but they've been looking to expand into their phase 2, for example, and this was recently rejected by the local communities because they felt like they hadn't been given enough time to see the repercussions of shipping in the Arctic and in their specific area. So one thing we know, like, that's been increasingly important over the past few years is the involvement of stakeholders. So in the Arctic, it would be indigenous communities. So their opinion is so critical to ensure that you have a smooth operations up in the Arctic, and it's really important to make sure that they're heard, that their opinion is heard. So some of the things that we implement with them is, for example, there's areas that are restricted, so we're just not allowed to send our ships in certain zones, and that's because there's marine mammals, protected areas that we don't want to disturb any of the marine life there. Another thing we implemented is there's areas where we're just not allowed to drift. So unless, of course, it's for safety purposes, but when a ship enters this zone, they enter, it's about 250 miles. They just have to transit, go directly to their anchorage or directly to the berth, no stopping, and they also have to follow specific waypoints to ensure that they don't get too close to communities, and just making sure that all stakeholders are happy. We also make sure that we try to limit any underwater noise, which is why we don't permit drifting as well. We make sure the ships come in convoys rather than one by one, because we feel that this will limit the impact on marine life. We avoid sailing on the ice edge because we know that that's where the hunters like to be. We advise communities before we transit in front of their community, just so that they know that the ship's coming in case anyone's out hunting and they can let us know. We don't break any ice at the beginning of the season, and actually for our 3 icebreakers, they all have blackout periods, we call them, and that's a few months in the wintertime when we're just not allowed to sail in certain regions in the Arctic, and that's because they're out on their ski-doos hunting in this area, and if our ships come and break up all the ice and create these tracks, it could be dangerous for them. So during a few months every year, our ships are laid up so that we don't interrupt their hunting and lifestyle. And then of course, we also report any marine mammal sightings and that as we transit any areas in the Arctic, we report this back to government.
Okay, great. And I'm finally going to turn to Dr. Pincus. Given what we've already discussed and heard, and certainly what I think many of us continue to read within the industry, all signs point to an increase in Arctic shipping traffic or polar waters traffic. I think everyone would agree there's direct geopolitical implications behind that, and especially from a US or allied perspective. Could you offer some thoughts on where we currently stand relative to that, what's forecasted, what we need to do to remain, as a country, speaking from a US perspective, to remain on pace with both allies and potential adversaries?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come here today. This is a wonderful event. So when we think about Arctic shipping, I first want to do a little bit of sort of ground truth orientation, just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what these Arctic shipping routes are. So when you think about the Arctic Ocean, it's the world's smallest ocean, and there's 3 major potential or actual shipping lanes. We can think about the Northwest Passage running through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. We can think about the Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's northern coastline. And then there's something called the Transpolar Route, which would be sort of a straight shot over the middle, and that's, very much a distant prospect. The Arctic region is losing sea ice. Numbers are bouncing around. We'd say about 15% a decade. And so there is this really rapid one-way reduction in sea ice that's driving a lot of excitement about Arctic shipping routes. Between certain pairs of northern ports, shipping through the Arctic can save up to 1/3 off of shipping time, and time is money. So there's a lot of excitement about these shipping routes. But if the Arctic, so I need to pour a little bit of cold water on this. Yes, the ice is melting. It still freezes every winter. It is still dark every winter. Operational conditions right now are very, very challenging. There's a lot of dynamism in the ice patterns, and we see a lot of unpredictability. So the spring and the fall seasons, when the ice breaks up in the spring and reforms in the fall, can be very unpredictable. We see a lot of year-on-year variability. Just 2 years ago, a large flotilla of ships got trapped in the eastern Russian Arctic for 2 or 3 weeks because the ice came in early. Winds shifted, it froze up, they got stuck for a few weeks until they could be broken out. So there is still tremendous unpredictability, and there are really significant operational hazards. It's not just sort of the darkness and the winter conditions, there's freezing fog, there's changing weather patterns. In many areas, there's not a lot of shore support. A lot of the Arctic is not charted to modern standards. So from an operational perspective, there's some really significant hurdles that are going to impede the development of Arctic shipping. And because it has this sort of seasonal unpredictability, and because the weather is so unpredictable, the Arctic is not viable for container shipping right now. Container shipping is built on this sort of just-in-time model, where you put a container on a ship and it's going to show up to the day somewhere else. With the Arctic, you just can't have those guarantees. There can be a lot of unforeseen delays, and there's also some pretty significant draft limitations in certain parts of these passages. Where there is a lot of growth right now is the sort of destinational shipping. The Arctic has a lot of resources, whether it's hydrocarbons, whether it's minerals or forestry products. VAdm lands, there's significant mining operations up in the north, and so there's a lot of that kind of shipping, bringing resources in and out of the Arctic region. There's also some difference in terms of sort of the geopolitics. So the Russian government has been on a multi-year, multi-decade push to drive traffic along its northern sea route. About 25% of Russia's GDP comes out of the Arctic. It's hugely important to the Russian state, the Russian economy. And their vision is to build this international shipping route, pull resources out of the ground. Russia's a petrostate, so they want to mine and drill and pump gas out and send those cargoes either west to Europe or increasingly east to Asia. that trajectory hit a real bump 2 years ago. The imposition of sanctions meant that the traffic along the NSR that had been growing pretty steadily really dropped off, and all of the international ship traffic stopped. So last year there was no international transits of the Northern Sea Route. I haven't heard of any this year either. There's a lot of Russian shipping along their coastline. They are putting oil on anything they can find, and they're sending most of it to China right now. And it's scary because they are now, this year, putting oil on conventional tankers, not ice class. And that's alarming because particularly in that eastern Arctic area, the water circulates towards the United States, right? And the Bering Strait, the maritime boundary that we share with the Russians is narrow. And so I think there's some really scary developments and we need to watch that. Another thing to watch is sort of the Russia-China relationship. So prior to 2022, China, Costco was shipping through the NSR. Over a dozen or so, a couple dozen transits per year. Costco has not been through the NSR in the last couple of years. It'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. You know, we're seeing sort of the broader question of Chinese compliance with the sanctions is a really interesting area to watch. The broad contours of that they're in compliance. But watching that trajectory, I think, is very important. And so I think, you know, we're in a real period of dynamism right now, and I think the takeaways would be that Russia is the one sort of pushing the gas hardest on Arctic shipping because of their economic interests, but also because of the war in Ukraine. We're seeing some really tremendous uncertainty. And I know we want to get to Q&A, so I'm just going to stop right there. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to leave that discussion or pivot quite yet to it, because I saw, Duke, you were shaking your head a number of times in the comments. Is there additional, something else you'd like to add to that?
I actually, Becca, don't take the shaking the head as a negative, is what you're saying. It was a shaking
No,
of
no,
head
I mean,
out there in the real world, and you are spot on, as always. I mean, absolutely, we have to look at an awful lot of the hyperbole that is around the whole image of Arctic shipping and all these massive savings, that the savings dissipate very, very quickly when you think that, yes, there are a half a dozen ports where you can actually save on miles steamed, but to put the cargo into a ship that now has to be built ice class, has to have people that are specially trained, has to be prepared for massive delays and diversions, as Beck is pointing out. That's why container ships aren't looking at these routes, and that's why destinational shipping is the builder. I'm nodding my head and agreeing vociferously with everything Becca just said, is that you know, this annual flight of the swallows to Capistrano, if I can mess up a metaphor, where the press every spring goes, oh my God, it's an ice-free summer in the Arctic. Well, they're not ice-free. I mean, yes, I've just come down from a voyage where we were able to get up to 77 north in a non-ice-breaking vessel, an ice-class vessel. But there was a whole bunch of other ice where ice doesn't normally hang out. And that's the flip side of what's going on here. With climate change, the ice situation is so much more dynamic. We are seeing what remains of multi-year ice in areas we never saw it before. We are seeing icebergs and iceberg remnants in the Beaufort Sea, which had never been seen before. And these are all impacting on shipping. And where I was shaking my head, James, was I think at the Russian latest gambit of throwing oil and hydrocarbons into non-ice strengthened vessels. That's a huge, risky maneuver in an environment that, again, as Becca pointed out, we in North America are likely going to reap the negative benefits of an incident because everything's going to be pushed our way. We've got to be watching what goes on and with open eyes. And not take the hyperbole and think that it's a free-for-all. We've got to work together to make sure that we are doing it all right, not just from commercial aspects, but from safety aspects. And that's, you know, far and above anything that comes to national security in my mind.
Thank you. Yeah, as a former tankerman myself, that the notion of having a vessel proceed knowingly in an area for which it is not specifically built and not integrated into a holistic, comprehensive operational risk management posture is very concerning. So we have a couple of minutes. I want to open the floor for questions, and maybe Carly would have.
Hi, thanks very much. Thank you, James. Thank you to the panel. I have a frivolous question for Duke. I have heard 4 outs and abouts, and I grew up 1 mile from Canada and Michigan. Are you from Canada?
Guilty as charged, absolutely proud of American Canadian flag everywhere I go.
Okay, well, I got accused of being Canadian once, so I'm a little sensitive to that.
Oh, I'm very happy for you.
But really, Mike, on a serious note, and this, I'm going to address my question to Admiral Gautier, but really it involves all of us, everybody in this room. China now considers itself to be an Arctic nation to protect the resources it's getting from Russia in the Arctic. China has more icebreakers than we do as an Arctic nation. What is our current inventory? And I know that the full burden doesn't fall on the Coast Guard, but I'm looking at you because I know that we've got old assets that some are medium, some are heavy. And I'm wondering, how can we as a community become advocates for more commercial icebreakers to protect our shores? This has to be a national security issue. In the previous session, we mentioned that, or the 2 previous sessions, we mentioned that it's not MARAD's job alone to advocate for maritime. We're all in this together, and the Coast Guard, how can the Coast Guard increase its voice to get the resources it needs to keep us safe as an Arctic nation? And what can we do to support you?
Carlene, thanks so much. It's always great to get a question on how much more you can do for the Coast Guard. So a couple of different things. First of all, didn't mention it in my remarks, but we've been required through a couple of different means to give Congress a sort of final estimate on how many icebreakers Coast Guard thinks it needs. And so where we're at on that is we think between our operations in the Arctic and Antarctic, about 8 or 9, and a fleet mix of at least 3 heavies, because those are the ones that we have to operate in Antarctica, and then a blend. So in that sense, you mentioned China. China has 2 icebreakers, the Shuilong 1 and Shuilong 2. They operate interchangeably in the Antarctic and Arctic according to their own interests. They intend on building more in conjunction with this their thought of a near Arctic state. Russia has over 50. A handful of those are nuclear, right? It's anticipated that they would need that, just given their really extensive Arctic shoreline. So in terms of us, we need to catch up, right? There's just no 2 ways about it. I think we're all behind where we want to be and need to be. It's taken decades to get the kind of congressional and administration after administration after administration support to get, in Coast Guard terms, the considerable funding necessary in order to get there. We have just opened up that wedge a couple of years ago, and we are gaining momentum on this. But what we appreciate is when elements like the Navy League, which walk the halls of Capitol Hill and duck into offices and so on and so forth, can have the kind of conversations that the Coast Guard cannot, in order to build understanding, number one, because there isn't always the full appreciation for that thing that's way up north, right? And so advocacy to have a consistent set of budgets over time that continue this work on getting from 2 to 3 heavies and beyond, to help us with this ask for this commercially available icebreaker. But even as important is the shore infrastructure that often gets overlooked. The build out of Seattle, which is going to be our preeminent Arctic launch pad for the United States Coast Guard, which is considerable expense We need support for that as well.
If I could just add on, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything that you just said, but I just want to add on and sort of put this icebreaker question in sort of the bigger context of U.S. shipbuilding as a whole, and look at the challenges that the Navy is having. China right now is building ships of all kinds faster than us. You know, they have an amazing ability to crank out, whether it's commercial ships, Navy ships. It's a real challenge, I think, across the board for our entire Navy and maritime system. And so I think I wanted to sort of put the iceberg question in that bigger context, look at our Navy shipbuilding repair, you know, the submarine construction. A lot of that is moving slower and having more problems than we would like to, and China's outpacing us across the board there. And so I think tying it all together in terms of we need to put a lot more energy and resources into U.S. shipbuilding and ship repair as a whole. And a piece of that is icebreakers, but a piece of that is, you know, destroyers and frigates and carriers and submarines, right?
And China is building its commercial vessels with hard military capabilities.
Dual use piece, I mean, we haven't even brought that up, but you know, absolutely correct.
Any other questions, Commissioner?
Yeah, Admiral Gautier, there's activity at IMO to displace Russia's position on, I think it's the Executive Council, the Steering Council, and replace them with Liberia. And so the cooperative nature of Arctic shipping, is it going to break even further? Is there any chance that Russia will completely withdraw from international maritime governance?
Yeah, Commissioner, so there are a couple of important meetings coming up at IMO that you're referring to. There's a council meeting and an assembly meeting. There's an election on who makes it on the assembly. There's a limited number there. We're working through, as a U.S. government, on how that's going to proceed. But there's also the Arctic Council, right? And so Russia's actions in Ukraine, you know, just despicable, illegal, unsanctioned. It is important to many of us to have the ability to maintain at least some dialogue, given the proximity of the U.S. to Russia. District 17, our Alaska district, for example, has functional communications with the Russian border guard because we have to. And there is a risk when there isn't an ability to have a mechanism by which a conversation necessary can take place. And so the US government is sort of deliberating agencies on what that means, how far, how little. And perhaps that's about as far as I can go as a government representative. Becca might have some insight, so we can speak a little bit more to that.
It's a challenge. I mean, it's present in international fora around the world where Russia is just being a bad actor right now. You know, there's places where it's not being a sort of full-scale bad actor. The Arctic Council, for example, is continuing to function, but there's a lot of places where it's really holding up the works, and I think it's an ongoing challenge to figure out how we move forward. Watch that space.
Yes.
I have a couple of perhaps naive questions. I've just begun to understand some of the shipping going on before my clients have just done this. And while the emphasis has been on what the U.S., how we can build icebreakers, isn't it not an international problem? If shipping is international, are there other countries that are building icebreakers to benefit this kind of shipping community? A. B. Is there any economic value for a private company to build icebreakers and charter them to the shipping industry? And the third question simply would be, I was on board the HMS Protector at the Millen, and they're spending a great deal of time in the Arctic with their vessel. They're not there they're there researching the Arctic bottom. With their very advanced materials to see what's there or what maybe shouldn't be there. So there's a lot of activity, not just from commercial shipping, but preventative or informational questions of who's doing what on the bottom as well. So I'm just throwing out some thoughts.
And while our panelists answer that, we're going into the final couple of questions. So I'm going to ask the last question come from either SUNY Maritime or Kings Point Cadet. We'll make sure that we put you on the spot. Some of you are in my class, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna add to your point about the private sector potentially building icebreakers. So quite a few years ago when, because we also have the same issues with the Canadian Coast Guard fleet, we're lacking as well. If anything happens in the Arctic in the winter, we have to rely on our own ships. We don't really have Coast Guard support in the winter time in those conditions. So VAdm did put in place a proposal to build icebreakers for the government at about 1/3 of the cost in Japan with our partners, where we build a lot of our vessels, but it was refused to build it in Canada. Yeah.
James, if I could,
Yes.
wade in a little bit. It's one of the lines we've been dealing with a lot in our consulting side of Martech Polar is looking at exactly that type of question. And one of the biggest problems is the massive cost in building a very capable icebreaker and maintaining that ship outside of windows of operation of the mall. We look at it from an American perspective of our window on the Arctic, and the period of time that a ship is going to be working and earning is very small compared to the capital costs of having it built, and that makes it difficult. I was surprised when the VAdm offer was very quickly rejected by the Canadian government at the time, because that was an offer that did allow for a very cost-effective construction of a number of highly capable ice-breaking ships and having them available in a low-cost return. But as an example of a dilemma right now is that the Japanese government is presently building a replacement for the research ship Mirai that will be a PC-5 class icebreaker ship. Their dilemma is the program will only have that ship working for 6 months of the year because it's not designed for Antarctic work, it's designed for the Arctic. The cost of cleaning the ship and then laying it up for essentially 6 months of the year as a commercial entity is very high, and that's a struggle. So, to say that a commercial alternative is out there, the closest I've seen, and again, this is not just because I'm a fan of VAdm, but the closest I've seen in a proposal of commercial operation was VAdm's proposal to the Canadian government, which allowed for a reasonable run out of the operational cost of the ship. And the second part of that one is getting the shipyards build the ships. And we've touched upon it, Becca touched upon it, is that not every shipyard can pivot to building high ice cost ships, icebreakers, and the hull forms and the steelwork. So it's a costly proposal to simply say, I want to build an icebreaker and run it.
Okay, thank you. Any cadets?
Coast Guard.
I'm sorry, terribly sorry. Yeah, the Coast Guard Academy as well. Yeah. Yes, Mr. Lieberman.
A lot of the people my age are much more becoming a lot more isolationist in nature and our policies and our desires. A lot of people just don't see the desire in having wars overseas anymore. My question is it seems like a lot of times the United States is always the one who has to take the burden for a lot of these things. Why isn't this becoming more of like a NATO issue? I would like to see maybe our allies be taking more of the responsibility, especially Northern Europe. Why is it America seems to be always the one who's bearing this burden?
I'm going to direct that to Dr. Pincus.
That's a good question, and I think, when it comes to the Arctic, I guess I would answer that by saying, On the US side of the Arctic, the US is an Arctic nation, right, by virtue of Alaska, and so the US and Canada work together very, very closely to steward that side of the Arctic region, because that's our real estate, that's our backyard. And whether it's cooperation through NORAD or, on the maritime side, there's just a great relationship there, and it's our responsibility. On the other side of the Arctic, so you have Russia, and then you have Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So that's sort of European Arctic, which is sometimes called the High North. We are seeing a tremendous amount of effort being undertaken by our allies over there, and it is an area where the US is taking advantage of our comparative strength, which is our allies, right? And so there's a lot more interest in NATO, in the Arctic region. Obviously, the accession of Finland and hopefully soon Sweden is really going to shift that dynamic quite a bit. And so I think I would say that we're really lucky to be, the Arctic is not the most important region for the United States. It's the Asia-Pacific. It's very, very clear, right? Europe is a very important theater for us right now because of the war in Ukraine. We're lucky to have very capable allies there with whom we are working really closely. We need to keep that level of coordination up. The sense of urgency in European security circles is amazing. I mean, the last couple of years are remarkable in terms of what the war has done for security budgets, in terms of NATO 2% pledges. Countries have done, just look at Germany, for example, right? So that's fantastic. The intelligence sharing is fantastic. The coordination is great. Can we sustain that into the future so we can focus on the Pacific? I think it's a great question. And I think that's where there's a lot of conversations now around sustaining NATO unity in the face of Russian attempts to undermine that, which would have repercussions for us all. What's happening in Europe right now has global implications, not just with regards to the Russian leadership, but for China as well. Because the signals that we are sending in Europe carry around the world, and they're about the rules-based order and global governance. So I think they're tremendously important. Turning inwards at home is not going to protect us from the global forces that are at play right now. We're at a turning point in history, and so I think we have to flex right now, but we're not doing it alone. Thanks.
Thank you.
And Admiral Gautier.
Just one sort of overarching comment here. So as the young people here in the room, as the midshipmen and the cadets graduate and enter into service to the United States or in industry, it's really important for you all to realize, and I get this every day from the circles that I travel in, there is no substitute to United States leadership. No one else is going to pick up this mantle in a way that the United States can only do this. And as a student of history, you've seen this again and again and again. What happens when we become isolationists and the consequences of that?
And I just want to add to that because I was invited to NATO's Allied Maritime Command last March. And I was invited to brief them on maritime security. And there is a keen interest to be a collaboration and a force projection on the maritime front. And maritime didn't always have the visibility it has today when it comes to NATO relations and force projection. So there is a keen partnership and a very committed one.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carlene and Admiral Gautier. I also want to, that closes this panel. I want to thank each and every one of the panelists for participating. Thank you, and thank you. I hope the conversation around this continues over lunch. That will be on the second floor. So we'll again have volunteers to help guide you down to the second floor. So